Companies today are collecting massive amounts of data on their products, their customers, and so much more. You may have noticed more notifications about cookies when visiting different websites, for instance. And unless you live off the grid, you're being tracked. You may not know what companies are doing with your information. You might assume it's being used for things like targeted advertising or product development. But you don't know for sure. So today, we're talking with someone who does know. In fact, he's the one advising companies on how to use that data and to do it with integrity. Randy Bean is the CEO of NewVantage Partners, helping Fortune 1000 companies become data-driven. He's also a prolific writer, authoring 150 plus articles for Forbes, Harvard Business Review, and the Wall Street Journal. And his new book comes out at the end of this month. It's called Fail Fast, Learn Faster: Lessons in Data-Driven Leadership in the Age of Disruption, Big Data, and AI. In it, Randy covers case studies of companies that have found success becoming data-driven. But he also covers the darker side of data ethics and the abuse of data. Let's talk about what it means to be truly data-driven, about growth in the industry, and about the ethics around collecting and using data. So without further ado, let's get to it. Welcome to Truth Be Known. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Truth Be Known. We have another exciting guest today. We have Randy Bean, CEO and founder of NewVantage Partners. Randy, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Lauren. It's a pleasure being here.
We're really, really excited to have you here. And then for people who don't know about NewVantage Partners, can you tell us a little bit about you, about the company?
Sure. NewVantage Partners was founded in 2001, so we've been in business for 20 years. We work with large Fortune 1000 companies as strategic advisors focused exclusively on data and analytics. We basically help them in four ways. We help them leverage data as a business asset. We help them become data-driven organizations. We work with them to forge a data culture, and we help them innovate with data in their businesses.
Now, I can imagine you've only gotten busier and busier over the last number of years doing this.
Yes. That's what's kept us going for 20 years. People have been at this for a long time, but really see it as the tip of the iceberg, and data initiatives are in their infancy. And even within the past decade, we've seen, for example, the emergence of the chief data officer role within major corporations, and that's only accelerated in recent years.
And I know you just released a brand new book, or about to release a brand new book called Fail Fast, Learn Faster: Lessons in Data-Driven Leadership in an Age of Disruption, Big Data, and AI. I really want to dig into the book. I had a chance to go through it, and you've got a ton of great content in there, and case studies and all of the things that you've been working on since you wrote the book. Can you tell us more about it?
I really wrote it as a summing up of my 35 years plus, so a generation in the data field, a perspective on how things have evolved, what I've learned, what are really the key issues, and what organizations and data leaders need to think about in terms of planning for the future. So I begin by talking about a history of how data has evolved over the past 35 plus years in terms of new sources of data, the uses of data across business as well as in broader society. I talk about the mindset and the change of mindset that's required to really be a data-driven organization, because data is an asset that flows across businesses, and you really have to look at it from a very different perspective. I talk about the cultural challenges that organizations face. The biggest thing that we hear from C executives of major corporations, we do a survey each year, and each year points out to 90% of the challenges for organizations really relate to cultural issues, organizational alignment, changes in processes, skill sets, everything revolving around change management. And then I go on to talk about the state of data within the large corporate world today in terms of where organizations see themselves in terms of their progress in being data-driven and having developed the data culture and what they see as the challenges. I talk a little bit about data ethics. That's probably the most controversial chapter in the book, because most of the book I'm saying how great it is to be in the data profession and how everybody should be data driven. And then I use this chapter to talk about the risks and the dangers of data when used improperly or used with bad intent. And then I close the book talking about data in the context of AI, and that's a look at the future and how organizations can enable their AI capabilities by having larger and larger volumes of data. And I close with one long case study in terms of providing a perspective that becoming data-driven is really a journey and it plays out over time.
Right. There's so many things I want to dig in there. And after 35 years of experience and putting together this book, and I know you've written a ton for HBR. So getting started, where do you think an organization who's on this journey to becoming more data-driven, where should they start?
Let me actually read from the very beginning of the book, because that really sets the tone and sets the key theme. So the book starts as follows. The world is in a race to become data-driven, now more than ever. The warp speed effort to organize scientific and epidemiological data from across the globe in a heroic effort to find a COVID-19 vaccine has illustrated the urgency and existential nature of this quest. We need data, science, facts, knowledge, and insight to make informed, wise, and critical decisions. Now more than ever, data matters, and having good data matters tremendously. So the point in all of that is there's a renewed urgency. There's been so much in the past couple of years, alternative facts, if you will. So data is becoming more and more important in terms of being able to get a complete picture for companies making decisions about what they're doing in terms of retaining customers or entering new markets, as well as it's come into play in terms of public health issues and understanding what is the data, what does this mean for us, what does this tell us. So data has really gone beyond a niche area of a small group of people buried in the basement of a large corporation to something that is not only in the C-suite, but really touches upon all aspects of society. And that's really what I've tried to do in the book. I've tried to write the book with three audiences in mind. One is C-suite executives, members of the board who really care about the business value. They don't care so much about the what. They don't care so much about the how relative to how things get done. They care about the what. What is the business benefit to them? What is the bottom line impact? Second audience I wrote for is data practitioners, and that's why I provided roughly 25 case studies in the book so practitioners can go deep, look at specific examples of what other organizations are doing and learn from those examples. And then lastly, I wrote for general readers who are trying to understand what is all the fuss about and why should they care about data and why data is important to all of us.
Oh, that's great. And you had mentioned using data to do things like figure out what markets to go into, product development. How do you see the role of data in decision making and really figuring out where a business should go?
Yeah, well, let me speak a little bit about my career evolution. So I started off in banking and financial services. I had studied English and history when I was an undergraduate, so hence why I've done a lot of writing on this topic. But I was trained as a COBOL and assembler programmer, and what that entailed was bringing data in, so that's inputs, and then doing things with it, and then sending it off to varying locations. And I was much more interested in the data and how it was used than I was in the programming. And at the time, I said to my colleagues, so what do we do with all this data that we're compiling on our customers? And they said, well, the regulators make us keep it for 7 years, and then we're free to destroy it. And I was like, what? This is a wealth of information that you can gain insight into your customers, their behaviors, and you can learn how to better serve those customers. Subsequently, I went into what was at that time, nascent field of database marketing. Now it would be known as CRM, and I worked with one of the early leaders in database marketing, and within a couple of years led their North American financial services database marketing practice, and then later their business to business and emerging markets database marketing practice. And what that was all about was understanding the totality of all of your interactions with your customers. So fundamentally, you could get, keep, and grow those customer relationships. And those interactions with the customers were really unique to your organizations. You could augment that with third-party behavioral, third-party external data, but each organization has this unique repository of data relative to their interactions with their customers that is unique and very powerful. So that's the orientation I came from. In other words, understanding the interactions with your best customers and how to leverage those to basically to retain and better serve those customers, and then to identify prospective new customers that had the same characteristics as your best customers.
So you've got a chapter in your book called Think Different, and it's talking about clients like CVS and Amex and Wells Fargo. Can you tell me a little bit about how you've helped those types of clients think different?
Yes, absolutely. And, time and time again, one of the things that hear and see is that thinking about data in an organization requires a different mindset. And so the second chapter of the book is entitled Think Different, Become Data Driven. It starts with this quote from the Apple computer Think Different advertising campaign of 1997, which I'll read briefly because it sets the tone. Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius, because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. Well, it doesn't mean that you have to be crazy or radical to become data-driven, but it means that you have to look at your current processes, your current skill sets, the people you have, how you're set up organizationally, and really take a very different perspective. As mentioned at the outset, data is an asset that flows across an organization. So that means that it's fragmented, it's siloed, there's different constituencies that own it. Some people may see a larger benefit in sharing their data. Others may have concerns about sharing their data. So there's a whole litany of issues that organizations have to confront in terms of evolving into an organization that leverages data as an enterprise asset.
And then as organizations leverage data as an enterprise asset, what are some of the things that you've seen organizations do with some of that data? And if I'm just getting started in trying to do this, where should I start looking?
Yeah, what we encourage organizations to do is to focus on business value and business use cases. And we say start small. Don't try to boil the ocean all at one time. So identify, try to really identify what is the most important business question that you need to answer today that you can't answer and that the data can help you with. And then identify what data is needed to answer that question. Rather than going out and getting all of the data, just get the specific set of data that you need to answer that question. Once you've answered that question, once you've shown business value, and once you can measure that value, that establishes an initial foothold of credibility with the business sponsors or the business leaders. And so then you can move to the second question and identify what's the second most critical question, what data is needed exclusively to answer that question, and repeat the process. And that starts to increase the credibility. It starts to build momentum, because too often what I see is I go into organizations, meet with the data teams. They talk about all of the capabilities that they've built. They're very proud of those capabilities. I then go and meet with the technology leaders. They similarly describe the capabilities that they've created. They're very proud of those capabilities. They're very robust. But then I'll go and meet with the line of business CEO, and they'll say, we don't have confidence in our data. We're not getting the data that we need to make the decisions that we need it. We're not receiving the data in a timely fashion. So obviously there's been a gap between the capabilities that have been built and the business questions that are trying to be solved. And sometimes, I speak to the technologists and they'll say, well, we're building an architecture, a platform for the long term, which is fine, but often business questions have to be answered in the day and in the moment, and results are measured and reported to, the street on a quarterly basis. So to get to that long-term view, it's very important to have a long-term platform and be thinking from a long-term vantage point, but at the same time, you need to demonstrate short-term results. You need to build up that immediate credibility. Otherwise, sometimes you just don't get to see the light of day for the long term.
No, I couldn't agree with you more on that. And how do you think both technologists and the business can get, actually, really, the business can get confidence in the data that they're getting?
One of the things that I try to do in everything that I write is to speak in language that everyone can understand and that business leaders can understand. Sometimes I tell folks that when I write with a CEO in mind, and therefore I'm writing at a third grade level. And what I mean by that is I'm trying to make things so simple, so basic that anyone can understand them. And that's often what happens. I go into organizations and speak with senior business leaders, and they say, MDM, data lake, data swamp. I hear all of this talk, and I just don't know what it means. I can't differentiate one term versus another. I need to understand what is the business impact in terms of, am I able to do something faster? Am I able to do something more cost effectively? Am I gaining greater insight than I had in the past? So it's really boiling things down to fundamentals and speaking business terms. And I find that when data leaders and when technology leaders are able to do that, that really breaks down the barriers. And the most effective organizations really see, it's not a barrier between data leaders and technology leaders and business leaders, but they really blend into one, and they're all business focused, but they're bringing various expertise and skill sets to bear, and they're ultimately speaking a common language.
That's awesome. And I like what you had said about making data so that everyone can understand it. And it sounds in a lot of ways you're kind of demystifying a lot of the buzzwords around becoming data driven and how you can make data useful, which I can imagine is really, really helpful for people on the business side who don't want to come across like they don't know anything, because, everyone wants to be data driven nowadays, but the wanting to be data driven and knowing where and how to make it useful are very different things.
Yeah, I had a business partner who I co-founded the firm with, and we were together for 12 and a half years before we actually did another software startup. And I remember going in and meeting with the president of a top 20 or so insurance company, the president of the consumer insurance division, and my colleague, the MIT PhD, explained in great brilliance and great depth, the cardinality and ordinality of data and all these like very complex themes. And it was a brilliant discussion. I think I followed about half of it, but I knew it was brilliant. And I didn't say a word the entire meeting until at the end, the president of the consumer insurance group turned to me, put his hand on my arm, and said, what exactly did that mean? And I said, it meant you could do it faster, more cost effectively, and as a result of that, you could better serve your customers. And he said, thank you. This was amazing. This was brilliant. But he really needed it kind of boiled down. He kind of thought he was getting the general idea, and it certainly sounded amazing, but he needed to know what the bottom line impact for him was in his business.
Oh, absolutely. And in some ways, it's that bridging between the technologist and the business person that you had mentioned earlier of, if you truly want to make great business decisions, the technologist needs to understand really what the business user needs, and the business user needs to understand and trust the technologist.
Yeah, and having started as a programmer back in the day, so to speak, I often heard my colleagues, and I often felt the same, that our business users couldn't articulate what they wanted, and sometimes it was like, well, we're going to have to build it based upon certain assumptions because they can't say what it is that they need. But at the same time, you have to bear with them because they're the ones that are ultimately closest to the customer and need to serve the customers and drive the revenue. So it's often difficult and challenging for business leaders to articulate things. So really, you just have to go the extra mile and put yourself in their shoes and see if you can see the world from their vantage point and say, well, is this what you're trying to do? And they'll say, yeah, that's what we're trying to do. The other thing is you need to have very agile, adaptive capabilities, and that goes to the title of the book about fail fast, learn faster. There used to be the old adage back in the COBOL programming days that if you wanted to change, regardless of what the change was, it was going to be 15 months and $3 million. We don't have that luxury anymore. The world's too fast moving. Organizations need to be able to move on a dime, and so need to be able to shift quickly, fail fast, learn from your mistakes. It goes to the old data science approach of test and learn. You're not wed to the algorithm that you're using. You're constantly tinkering. And so it's shortening these cycle times and operating in a highly agile environment that helps organizations adapt and be successful.
That's great. And it reminds me a little bit of some of the content you've written for HBR. And you've written about how companies struggle to develop a data-driven culture. What does being data-driven mean to you? And then how do you think companies can actually become and develop that data-driven culture across both technology and the business and really drive results?
Yeah, it's a great question because data-driven doesn't mean being a robot where you just look at the data and thereby make decisions blindly. You have to bring to bear, human judgment and experience, but you should look at the data. You owe it to yourself, you owe it to your customers, you owe it to your colleagues, and you owe it to the industry to gather the best possible data, the most accurate, the most timely, the highest quality data you have. Look at it, review it, analyze it, synthesize it, digest it, and then make some decisions. So for me, that's fundamentally what being data-driven is about. The other thing that's a risk with data is that, data can be presented to represent almost any particular point of view or any particular case to make this decision or make that decision. So data in and of itself, you sometimes have to look at, where was this data produced? What assumptions lay behind this? Who produced this? Because data can be very selectively cherry picked to make about any argument, and that's a little bit one of the themes that I talk about in the data ethics section of the book. Is that data can potentially be misused as well as it can be used effectively, but at least beginning from a starting point where you have not only as much good data as available, but you have good people with good judgment and a variety of viewpoints, so that you can come up with a critical perspective and not a strongly biased perspective in terms of the decisions you make from the data you have.
So as you think about your role in data, what do you think the biggest changes will be over the next 5 or 10 years?
Well, I think that we're just at the beginning of the journey, actually, after a generation. Data sources only continue to proliferate. I was speaking with the 23-year-old CEO of a new AI company that I believe has something like an $8 billion valuation last week, and he was telling me 80% of data is unstructured. And that wasn't something that I'd really thought about, particularly working with financial services and life sciences clients. And I played that back to a number of very serious, thoughtful people that I know in the space, and they say, yeah, it's interesting because it's really the tip of the iceberg in terms of organizations and the data that they're working with and the data that they're dealing with. And there's whole new sets of signaling data and GPS and pictures and text and images that organizations haven't even begun to grapple with in a meaningful fashion. So I see the data profession only growing and growing exponentially over the next 10, 20, 30 years. Chief data officers are just in their ascendancy. They're going to become more and more critical in the coming decades. I just received notification that the university that I went to is introducing a new data science major next year. So we're really at the beginnings in many respects of the data revolution, and we also have a responsibility to basically shepherd that in a responsible fashion and not abuse it or not become victims to misuses of data.
I think you're completely right, and I think this is an interesting segue. You have written about data ethics, and I would love to talk a little bit about data ethics. What you see as some of the potential problems that becoming so data driven creates, and just sort of dig in there a little bit.
Yeah, I'm going to read from a couple of quotes I have in the book, and I call this the good, the bad, and the ugly. And this is all from the chapter on data ethics. So one quote is, "We had all of the data, we just didn't connect the dots." Well, that's from the 9/11 Commission. They had all this data captured from all these various sources and intel information, but they couldn't put the pieces together in time to avert what happened. Um, we will make our decisions guided by expertise, data, and science. Actually, that's a quote from now former Governor Andrew Cuomo a year ago when he was saying, how they were going to use expertise, data, and science to guide the decisions they were making about treating COVID. As it turns out, even though that was a noble intention, I believe that there were a lot of data, such as in the nursing homes in the states of New York, that they didn't use in that fashion. So it's one thing to say even the right thing. It's another thing to fully act on it. Here's another quote. "Big data will create winners and losers, and is likely to benefit the institutions who wield its tools over the individuals being mined, analyzed, and sorted." So the point there is that big data will create winners and losers, and data can be abused. I love this quote. This is from an article that had appeared in the New York Times, and I quote from this. This is from a few years ago. It says, "Big data is the big bad of our moment. Companies and governments amass enormous troves of information about our online and offline activities so they can understand them better than we do. Creepy firms like Cambridge Analytica mine big data from websites such as Facebook. Facebook itself seems increasingly creepy, grounded in lying to the public about what happens to the data it collects." So, there's really a tip of the iceberg in terms of some of the data and ethical issues. A few years ago, I read Weapons of Math Destruction by Kathy O'Neill, and she talks a lot about algorithmic bias, and I quote from her in this book, and have also done work with and quoted from Cam Kerry, who was with the Brookings Institution. His brother, John Kerry, was the Democratic Party nominee for president in 2004, and he's doing a lot of work in terms of developing ethical data standards. In Europe, they have GDPR, and in California, they have I always get this wrong, the CPA. So selectively, different geographic entities in different states and countries are establishing data standards, but for the most part, it's been, there's no common standards.
So as business leaders or as technologists, what do you think we can do as we build out our own data programs to use data ethically and try to eliminate some bias?
Yeah. Well, there's organizations like MasterCard that are doing a fabulous job with this, and I talk about MasterCard at length in the book with their chief data officer, Joanne Stonier, and they've established the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. And they try to look at opportunities to help gather and use data to solve a variety of social and governmental issues. They also have established very strict ethical standards in terms of, because they capture data across a wide array of customers and customer institutions, to make sure that that data is only used for purposes that basically everybody has agreed to and signed off on. So that's one organization that's establishing very formal policies, practices, and structures around ethical data management. But for most organizations, this is somewhat of a new area, though I host quarterly C Executive Roundtable, and a few years ago I hosted one on the topic of data ethics. And I said to my colleagues, this will probably be the least attended of these sessions. And it was actually the most attended and the most passionate in terms of the participation.
I can definitely see that. We hosted an event at Talend called Talk Data with Me, and we had a bunch of different women in various roles, from an analyst. We had a NASA astronaut come on, a woman who was a coder, another woman who taught a spy school, and really talked about sort of when we had a panel on data and bias and how do you overcome bias in data. And one of the things that I thought was fascinating during that conversation, and it more went towards even some of the AI and some of the data that we use inherently as we build it comes with a degree of bias versus on the ethics side. And one of the things we had discussed was that I had no idea when people are going through training to be astronauts, everyone is scored and ranked, and you have to be trained to be an astronaut, and here's all the programs you have to sit through. So obviously, here's the tasks we all have to do. And we do these tests, we take these, physical tests, and that's how you understand, are you ready to be an astronaut? Are you not ready to be an astronaut? It's all very data driven. And it's all supposed to be very unbiased. And this woman who was the astronaut who had just gotten back from the International Space Station brought up a point, and she said, well, actually the spacesuits are designed for people who are, 6 feet tall to 6'4" and 180 pounds. So you're trying to get this whole, generation of women training to be astronauts, and it turns out all the spacesuits are for someone, and I'm 5'1", that if I put on this spacesuit, I wouldn't be able to move in it. And it's, we're going by the data to understand who the top performers are, and are you ready to do this, without taking that step back to go, well, are the conditions even set up to be equitable? And I think that's something everyone on the panel really sat and took away. And it's something that I've really taken away and taken to heart of, yes, the data may tell you this, but what is the underlying bias? What is the thing? And is the data set that we're pulling from equitable and relevant? And does it have all the context?
Yes, context is so critical. And it's interesting to your point because there is obvious examples of algorithmic bias, and not to go too far down this track, but it gets into many issues such as, I guess you could even argue about questions of political correctness in terms of the biases that are brought to bear. Because, for example, the Kathy O'Neill book, Weapons of Math Destruction, I had interviewed her and I had written about her, and I was discussing her book with one of colleagues who's a very senior executive in the industry and has been a leader in data for many years. And he said that he resented her book, that it went to the extreme and that it used extreme examples to suggest and illustrate that certain behaviors were the norm. In their organization, they had gone so far to try to be ethically compliant, to protect the privacy of their customers, that they felt that the book was a distortion and a disservice. And I was surprised at the vehemence of the reaction. But basically, when I came to think about it in terms of this executive and his team of hundreds of people had gone to great pains and fought the internal battles and argued internally, these are the reasons why we need to do the protections, and then to feel that they were blindsided by a book that took what he thought were easy shots. It's interesting. So, it's a complex area. There's not just one easy answer. As with most data questions, there's not any easy answers. It's a long-term journey. It's a process. There's multiple points of view, but that's what makes it interesting.
100%. And I think that is one of the things that gives everyone in the data profession a lot of job security. Is this is not easy. It's going to be ever changing. And one of the points that has really stuck with me over the course of the interview is the people who will do really well, will have a big impact, are going to be the people who, yes, understand the technology, but also understand the business. What are the key problems you're trying to solve? And how do you figure out what the specific data you need is? And how do you translate that to the rest of the audience? It is great to be the smartest person in the room, but you have to be able to communicate your results to everybody else in the room to get that buy-in.
I couldn't agree more. Communication is essential, and it's there's a lot of smartest people in the rooms, but particularly in the data and technology fields. But it's the ability to really communicate and to convey the core messages, the business value, the business benefit, why each individual has to buy in and play their part. And to that point, I hear many organizations paying lip service to change. We need to change the way we do things, but usually people are all for that when it means somebody else changing. When it means them changing the way they do things, they're less quickly to embrace that.
It is a lot harder when it's you that has to do the work. This has been a really great, informative interview and podcast. I want to switch topics and go to some quick decision questions. So much of what we do, especially on the data side, not as quick, involves a little bit more analysis. So it's always good to end on what are some quick decisions, not things to don't overthink anything. You ready?
I'll do my best.
Okay. What is one talent or skill that is not on your resume?
Wow. One talent or skill. Wow, boy, that's a tough question. I think about the only things that I do well is trying to communicate complex things to a wide audience. I'm not the expert. People often think I'm the expert. They say, "Oh, well, you're the expert in big data. You're the expert in AI." They'll start talking to me about various platforms and architectures and all this type of stuff, and I'll say, I don't know, and I actually don't really need to know. So yeah, I mean, I'm not the expert. I'm not the person who's the technology or algorithm expert. And frankly, Tom Davenport writes in the foreword to the book, if you came looking for a deep technical discussion or deep algorithmic discussion, you've come to the wrong spot. And then he goes on, but this doesn't mean that this isn't an important book for you, because it is really about the business value of these outcomes and how you can take the architecture and the algorithms and learn how to translate that into business value. So, my weakness is that, I'm not the deep guy on the technology. There was a time actually when I was, but that was a long time ago.
I think making the complex things simple is a great skill set that we could probably all use to do a little bit better. So is there a book, podcast, or TV show that you've been binging lately?
The other thing that I do when I'm not doing this business stuff is I'm co-chair of an international writers in residence program that we bring in writers who have won Pulitzer Prizes and National Book Awards and the Booker Prize. And one of our writers actually won the 2020, received the 2020 Nobel Prize in Literature. So I spend a lot of my time reading literature and history and even poetry. And when people say, "Oh, have you read the latest business book?" I say, no, not so much. And when people ask me if I was going to ever write a book, I said, well, maybe if it's the sequel to Moby Dick or The Great Gatsby. So, but I broke down and I did write this book.
Awesome. What's your favorite book?
Oh, I'll always say Moby Dick. You can read it many times in many different ways, and it's actually a hilarious book. I actually enjoy it more for the parts that are absolutely hilarious than the serious part. The serious parts, like Over My Head, are too deep for me, but it's hilarious in terms of the little anecdotes throughout.
And you know what? I think we could all use a little levity. What advice do you have for data professionals stepping into leadership roles for the first time?
Number one is listen, observe, have a long-term focus. Don't suffer from hubris or overconfidence. Many people have come before. Many people have tried. Many people have failed. I don't know how many organizations I go into when the executives say, "Oh, another data project," and their eyes roll. So you really have to be empathetic. You have to put yourself in the shoes of your business sponsors and business constituents and think about how you can be helping them, how you can gain their trust and confidence, how you can make data understandable to them. Often have helped organizations go through data lineage exercises where they understand how data is produced, where data is consumed, who touches it, where new data is created, because that makes it real as opposed to abstract. For many organizations, when you use the term data, it can seem awfully abstract, but yet almost virtually everybody within an organization is touched with data in many, many ways, and it's making it understandable to them. Since I wrote the book, I've gone out in various scenarios where I'm with various people, and there'll be something like, "Oh, here's the latest data from the vaccine," or "Here's the latest data on COVID," or "Here's some latest data in sports," or whatever the case may be. But I'm always putting them that, "Oh, big data, big data, big data, big data," because everything that you see and hear around you, be it political polls or whatever the case may be, it's all about the data. So there's so much value to be gained from people becoming data driven, and in the data profession there's just loads of opportunity, and data continues to proliferate, and the demand for managing data and being able to get to the insights and the learnings and the key business benefits and takeaways is just critical.
And last question, what's the top piece of advice you'd give yourself 10 years ago?
Take a long-term perspective. Life is short. Learn from experience. You can't change everything overnight. What I try to do in the book is provide some perspective and some history, because sometimes I see people caught up in the moment and they think the newest capability or the newest type of information, the newest algorithm is it's the only thing that's happening. And I think it's helpful to have some perspective, both in terms of where we've been and where we have the opportunity to go.
I think that is great advice. And thank you so much for joining us on the show, for sharing a ton of insights and wisdom. And for everyone out there that is looking to get started in data, become smarter in data, and just learn a little bit more, definitely check out Randy's new book, Fail Fast, Learn Faster: Lessons in Data-Driven Leadership in the Age of Disruption, Big Data, and AI. It's a ton of case studies. It is really, really useful and helpful. And thank you again so much for being on the show.
It was my pleasure being here. Thank you.
Truth Be Known is brought to you by Talend. A leader in data integration and data integrity, Talend enables every company to find clarity amidst the chaos. Talend Data Fabric brings together in a single platform all the necessary capabilities that ensure enterprise data is complete, clean, compliant, and readily available to everyone who needs it throughout the organization. Learn more at talend.com. That's TALEND.com.